This week, we are covering mass incarceration and the school to prison pipeline. I thought we could start off with this image. By now, a lot of you are familiar with these shocking statistics. The documentary 13th that I've assigned for this particular module goes into details about this. But currently, we have over 2 million Americans in prison. That is startlingly higher than any other nation in the world. And so you have the numbers here that show us how many folks are incarcerated in places like India or Russia or China, which many of us imagine as a very authoritarian state. And then if you look at the numbers disaggregated by race, and then further add in the intersections of race and gender, you find that Black American men are incarcerated at rates that are much higher than any other group in society. Increasingly, folks are also pointing out that the rates are disproportionately higher for Black American women, as well as growing rates for Latinx folks. And of course, in our immigration segment, we'll go deeper into talking about detention centers and how they are becoming more and more a part of this prison for profits phenomenon. The documentary 13th covers several different themes, and as students of sociology of race, I'm hoping that you are able to apply the theoretical ideas of Omi and Winand to a lot of the themes that 13th discusses in terms of this constant reiteration of racism, right? Even as we are imagining reform or in our head thinking of it as progressive reform, we see that racism manifests in new ways. And that's why I encourage my students to go do their own research as well. We are living in the midst of these movements right now, which are calling for the abolition of police, abolition of the prison system, and so on. And what does it mean when we're talking about defunding the police, abolishing prisons? I think some of us react very quickly to that as, wow, that's a very scary scenario. And I always like to push my students to expand their imagination to think about a society where we are reimagining some of these very embedded institutions that are so embedded that they become naturalized, normalized, right? It's hard for us to then imagine a society without prisons or without police. But that's how it felt to folks who were fighting for the abolition of slavery as well. Remember, this was an institution of human bondage that we based our entire national economy and society on. It was just as radical to think of abolishing this system of enslavement in that moment. So 13th is showing us how it is that we get to these numbers of over 2 million people in prisons, and is making the argument that this is a legally embedded system of enslavement. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, had these loopholes that the documentary is highlighting, which is if we can put these folks behind bars, you can suspend any of their rights, right? And this is precisely what we did in history. We instituted the Black Codes right after the Emancipation Proclamation and arrested African Americans en masse for things like loitering and vagrancy, established the chain gangs which again formed that free source of labor that our economy was so dependent on. And as folks like Angela Davis and Michelle Alexander will point out to you, this is what we are continuing to do, right? A lot of it is hinged on creating and really sustaining this mythology of Black criminality, right? That has existed right from the beginning, especially after emancipation and with some iconic pop culture things like The Birth of a Nation, right? That the documentary points to. And we continue that narrative in present times, where we see Black and brown men as predators, as dangerous, including Black children who are not then seen as children. And politicians have absolutely capitalized on that primitive fear, right, in our mainstream, where initially there was literally terrorism against the Black population that fueled the migrations from the southern part of the US to other parts of the US, where Black folks were escaping lynchings and terrorism by the Klan and so on. And that open violence becomes more replaced after the civil rights movement and so on, where Nixon becomes the law and order president, and then Reagan weaponizes the war on drugs and so on, further exacerbated by Clinton's policies such as three strikes, etc. So tough on crime kinds of policies. And it's come back a full circle with Donald Trump now talking about law and order. So this Southern strategy that the movies highlight has its roots there, but it's continuing, right? A veiled effort to decimate Black communities to appeal to white voters. And you're seeing this happening now as protesters now become rioters, as you start to see this backlash against the Black Lives Matter movement. Angela Davis's essay is talking about the prison industrial complex. This is a set of bureaucratic, political, and economic interests. It's the nexus of bureaucrats, politicians, corporations, right, that encourages spending on imprisonment irrespective of whether the crime rates are going up or down. There's no correlation between incarceration and crime rates, is what social researchers are presenting to us, which is mind-boggling, right? Black and Latino youth are further stigmatized, hypercriminalized once they enter the juvenile justice system, even if many are arrested for nonviolent offenses. Michelle Alexander captures that piece of how once you have the record, it stays with you and locks you into a caste-like status. There is no mobility once you have that. Again, the prison industrial complex, what Angela Davis is calling masked racism, is hinged on that mythology of Black criminality, where we know that profiling by law enforcement is much higher in communities of color. Police brutality is much more common. Stop and frisk policies continue, even though they have been deemed unconstitutional, right? So there's rampant harassment, even when they don't yield arrests. Again and again, social scientists tell us that drug use is about the same in communities of color versus suburban communities that might be predominantly white. But the consequences are very different because rates of profiling, surveillance, arrests are much higher in communities of color, right? The other aspect that Angela Davis points out quite a bit is that there's a lot of money riding on this now, right? So many corporations use prison labor, where the prisoners are paid next to nothing. Of course, the prisoners more recently we know have been fighting our fires, our continuing fires in California and other parts of the West Coast. And in some cases, if for non-violent offenders, very recently, they can get eligibility still to be firefighters, but for most folks, this wasn't a possibility. And so you have prisoners being used for all kinds of labor, right? To not only in the retail sector, for electronics, for making missiles, right? Levi's Jeans has been using them, Apple Computers, JCPenney, whichever industry you can think of. And this is problematic because prisons are very expensive, right? So a lot of the folks studying this point out that imprisonment is the most expensive form of punishment. We're spending $100,000 on one prisoner per year. So sometimes folks use the logic of, well, aren't these bad guys? Like, if they are in prison, might as well use their labor. Isn't it much better that way? Well, who's profiting from that, right? Not the taxpayers. Taxpayers are paying the bill of having these folks behind bars, right? The corporations are profiting not only from the labor, but from things like phone calls that prisoners make home. And now it's broken up into different little parcels. So the corporation that supplies food to these folks, other ones that are doing anger management, job training, parole and re-entry, right? All of that has been privatized. So anytime you have things like prisons, healthcare, education for profit, you're going to have very warped incentives, right? The incentive there is not to rehabilitate folks. It's not for the betterment of the common good. No, the incentive there is profit, right? Which means you want to keep all your prisons full for the longest time possible, right? It's just like a hotel or lodging industry. And how do you manage to do that if crime rates are dropping? You change the laws, right? Which is why lobbying becomes so important. If you have control over what laws get made, over legislation, right? Which is why 13th highlights the role of ALEC, which is very powerful, right? And we don't have any restrictions on campaign finance. So all of these politicians are then serving the purpose of these corporations, right? Which is why you see the change in sentencing laws, more and more nonviolent offenders behind bars, mandatory minimums so that they go in for the longest time possible, right? And you see those changes happening as we change from public to private, right? Michelle Alexander covers the new Jim Crow aspect of it. She calls it the new Jim Crow to highlight this caste system that she's talking about, of a permanent second class status. There are more African Americans incarcerated today than were enslaved in 1850, right? Some of the other shocking things we learn is that the life expectancy for Black men behind bars is higher than for Black men outside of prison, right? So a lot of folks have been pointing out that racism is a pandemic we haven't been paying attention to, that death rates for Black folks has always been high, and the death rates for white folks during the pandemic is just about now catching up with Black death rate. So as we think about the prison system, think about how this is always connected with other institutions in our society. Who has healthcare? Where are the poverty rates the highest? Who has access to education and living wage, and so on and so forth. So Michelle Alexander points out how early this starts with stop and frisk, and that's a good segue into our next topic of the school to prison pipeline. Right?